Hello and welcome to the MCR History Talks, a podcast produced by the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, brought to you by the University of Manchester Postgraduate History Network. I'm Adam Waddingham.
And I'm Jessica White, and we're both history PhD students at the University of Manchester.
This week, alcohol and drinking cultures. Jessica, how's lockdown changed your drinking habits?
Well, obviously during lockdown, a whole new culture evolved, and we saw in the first opening weeks, the rise of the quarantini, those cocktails made in lockdown. And I think as the initial boredom set in, people saw drinking as a required antidote to the potential endlessness of lockdown. I certainly gave into that habit at the beginning, but then I input a new rule in my life, which was only Fridays and Saturdays, and I've kept that up now. I think the excessive drinking ebbed away as restrictions measured eased, and especially when pubs and bars were allowed to reopen on the 4th of July.
Definitely, and I think as both you and I saw on the 4th of July, the streets of Manchester were filled with young people, very juiced up and eager to carry on drinking the night away. I think so many young people were elated basically with the fundamental concept of our lives being reinstated in a sense. But this return was also demonised by the media, shock horror, by those who, and I mean understandably in a sense, in one way, were kind of worried about a further spread of COVID-19.
Yeah, and that is not new. The demonisation of drinking habits and alcohol, as we're going to explore in this podcast, has been happening since day dawn. Drinking has never been something that has been encouraged by the state and by culture in general.
Exactly. So this week we're going to be joined by three historians who look at drinking culture in the 18th and 19th centuries, and who really have a specialism in the Northwest and of the Northwest. So we're going to be joined by Dr Gemma Outen, an early career researcher in gender construction and the 19th century press. Her PhD considered the literature of the female temperance movement, and her monograph arising from that, Lips That Touch Liquor, Fighting for the Face of Female Temperance, is due for publication in 2021. We're also joined by Craig Stafford, who gained his PhD in history from the University of Liverpool in 2018, for which he looked at female drunkenness in Lancashire, concentrating on the lives of women who were committed to Strangeways prison in the 1870s.
So without further ado, so here it is, the history of alcohol and drinking in the Northwest. Hi all, and thank you again for joining us for this discussion on alcohol and drinking cultures. It really is a great pleasure to have you here. So with us today is Dr Gemma Outen, who is an early career researcher from Edge Hill University, and Dr Craig Stafford from the University of Liverpool.
As Jess just said, thank you all very much for joining us for this kind of slightly different podcast to usual. Now, before we begin, it is worth saying that the focus of this is on pre-20th century history and histories of drinking culture and temperance, and the dominant attitudes that come in this period towards drink and attempts to regulate alcohol.
So both of you look at the 19th century, and I was wondering, Gemma, what would you say were the dominant attitudes to drinking over the 19th century?
I mean, it's an interesting period, the 19th century, because we've come from earlier on with sort of gin craze, which a lot of people know about, obviously, and Hogarth's propaganda, Gin Street, Beer Street, all of that sort of thing. When we get into the 19th century, I feel like there's an interesting sort of split going on almost in temperance and drinking. They sort of coexist together. So
when I was looking at my research, particularly, I mean, the Victorian period is my era, if you like, but it's a long period, it's 60 odd years, so there's like peaks and troughs, I suppose, in concerns about drink. But generally speaking, the 19th century, the Victorians have an obsession with drink. There's an obsession with drunkenness. So social commentators in particular are linking drunkenness to crime. They're linking it to an increase in disease and poverty. There's concerns about a growth in insanity due to drink, and also a concern about the growth in prison numbers. So there's concern about strange ways. Walton Jail one summer in 1871 is overcrowded apparently with female drunkards, so much so that the local bridewells have to sort of have this overspill of sort of female drunkards who've taken advantage of the hot weather like we've got now. So it's really, in many ways, it's an obsession of the Victorians, but we're really talking about public drunkenness. We're talking about working class drunkenness. They're the people who are being focused on by middle class social commentators in particular.
I was going to say, I think that's particularly interesting, Craig, in the sense of, so one of the things you talk about in your research is Chief Constable Samuel Stevens. And I wonder if this is a crossover with some of the work that Gemma focuses on around kind of the moralising attitude here, in the sense of both cultures of policing drink and cultures of temperance seem to have at their root this very moral concern.
Yeah, very much so. I in my sort of doctoral thesis, I talk quite a lot at length about this split between sort of legislative action and moral suasion. And I think Craig's right. It's predominantly the sort of working classes are the focus of this, you know, they can't drink, it's bad for them sort of thing, in line with sort of rises in self-improvement and rational recreation and things like that. But very much, I think there is a distinction to be drawn between the legislative side of temperance particularly, and concerns about, you know, bringing in a sort of prohibition-esque idea from the US, but also then this moral activism, which is where my research focuses on. How do we convince these people not to drink because it's good for them? Although temperance does start as a radical movement, certainly by towards the end of the century, where I, you know, focus, it has become this moralizing thing. And this is where I think we get our views of middle class as being something that's imposed on the working class and the drunkards there, sort of thing.
Well, yeah, well, Gemma, you've written on the representation of alcohol in temperance magazines, which are produced by these middle class female organisations, and you look at the way in which children were the target of these didactic cartoons or stories around the evils of alcohol. So why do you think alcohol has for such a long time been demonised in British culture?
I think that if we look back at the effects it has, has had, you know, beer is always viewed as this sort of emblem of Britishness somehow, and then when you get the sort of like I said, the gin craze, etc., it leads to poverty, degradation, etc. But I think it's no coincidence that, you know, at the time there's not a huge amount sort of going on. It's, you know, St. Monday's declining, things like that. People go to work, they go home, there's not really a lot happening. Whereas I think by the time we hit the 19th century and certainly sort of 1830s onwards, rational recreation comes in, self-improvement, there's a big rise in the sort of nonconformist religious movement. And I think those things all come around at a right time for temperance actually to explode almost, and it to become this idea of we're going back against that demonization. People shouldn't be drinking for their own good.
Because there's another thing as well, I think, when you talk about that, Gemma, in the sense of if we use class as one of the lenses to look at this, I think one of the things that comes through from your work actually as well, Craig, is talking about how when we think of state intervention, state agents in this sense, you kind of make the point, and I think it's quite a good one actually, around how police officers, particularly, you know, the people at the front end policing this, were actually working class, and different approaches adopted in different localities. And I think something to be said potentially about the approaches in different areas.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, my research, I look particularly at a comparison of Salford and Rochdale, and there's a definite difference in the way that drunkenness was policed in both towns. So, for instance, in Rochdale, and going back to your point about the moral sort of aspect of policing, Rochdale's chief constable really starts to clamp down on drunkenness, and there's but generally speaking, I mean, police forces would only really arrest somebody if they were extremely drunk. So if they were drunk and incapable, they were unable to sort of look after themselves or get themselves home, or if they were drunk and disorderly, if they were being violent. But in Rochdale, what we start to see, particularly after the 1872 Licensing Act, which makes simple drunkenness offence. So again, it's a very sort of vague sort of term. But Rochdale's police start to arrest people for being simply drunk, so just being a little bit tipsy. So whereas before 1872, you could sort of stagger home from the pub, and as long as you weren't causing any problems, you'd be fine. After 1872, they integrate this legislation, and they start, and everybody, the number of people, men and women in Rochdale arrested for drunkenness and imprisoned for drunkenness sort of goes through the roof, really. Whereas in Salford, there's much more of a focus on violence. So there's a lot of concern in Salford about the rise in common assault, the rise in assaults on the police. And this is all, again, linked into an increase in drunkenness. So there's a definite difference in the way that the police address this issue, which is interesting for two towns that are sort of fairly close neighbours, really.
That's I bet the records for those arrests are absolutely fascinating.
They are, yeah. I mean, some of the sort of newspaper reports are really, I mean, they made good copy, let's put it, let's be honest. Yeah, I mean, some of the descriptions of what people are up to is we can look at it from the hindsight for 350 years in the future and find it perhaps a little bit amusing now and again. But I think if you were a policeman in the middle of Salford on a Saturday night, it probably wasn't a great deal of fun.
Is there something to be said here in terms of how these spikes in temperance activities, I'm thinking in these moments when temperance really takes hold, is seen as moments when people are turning to drink in different ways? So we have this kind of gin craze. Is there a correlation with how temperance movements react, or is it just a much more general perception of an increase in drinking?
I certainly think it's the perception. In the same way, throughout the century, a lot of my work focuses on print culture as well, and a similar thing happens with crime. For instance, there's more reporting of crime in the period. There's this perception that crime increases. Actually, if you look at the statistics, it wasn't particularly increasing by a huge amount, if at all. And I think a similar thing happens with drinkingness. The conversation opens up because of the rise of the temperance movement and things like this. I don't think, and I'll be honest, I haven't done the statistical research to back that up, but I'm pretty sure there's not this huge increase in drunkenness. Britain as a culture has sort of historically always drunk a lot. I'm not sure this has a massive increase in the 19th century, although Craig, you've got more of a sort of record-based approach than me. You may differ on that.
No, not at all. I think that it's funny that sort of the end of the 1860s, there's very little debate in the local press that I've seen about drunkenness, and then it's as though a switch gets turned on in sort of 1870, 71, which I think is sort of taps into national debates. Drink becomes very much a party political issue. There's a divide between the Liberals and the Tories over the drink issue, and it's as though police statistics are suddenly seized on, and all of a sudden there's temperance sort of advocates writing into the newspapers complaining about drink. There's lists of people being arrested for drunkenness and prosecuted appearing in the papers. It's almost overnight, and it's a very strange. It's difficult to pin down exactly what caused it, but there's something going on that sort of. But you might be able to help me out on that.
Gemma raised her hand.
Sorry, I think because it's a thing that because again, print culture. There's a huge rise in the mid-century on just the sheer number of periodicals, newspapers, and things around, and I think a lot of it comes down to they had to fill the pages. So we get a huge increase in people writing into newspapers and magazines, but also, people have to write to fill these. The expansion in the press and the periodical press is huge at the end of the century because of the reduction in stamp duty and paper tax being abolished and things like that. So I think a lot of it comes down to they had to fill the pages.
Making the news.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really interesting here in some ways, and it's touched upon, I think, by kind of all of your work, actually on the importance of gender. And when we come to think about the demonisation of drink, women were, and still are actually, kind of particularly vilified when it comes to talking about drink and drinking cultures. Craig, you in particular kind of looked at female drunkardness in Lancashire.
Yeah.
What do you think, if anything, if there's a strong link between gender, drinking and alcohol cultures?
Yeah, very much so, certainly in the Victorian period and even probably before, to be honest. But women, to the Victorians, a drunken woman was seen much worse than a drunken man. They were doubly damned, is the phrase that gets sort of thrown about a bit. Is that they were traitors not only to society by engaging in this very unrespectable pastime, but they're also traitors to their sex. So if you think of a Victorian woman, the image of the angel in the house, she was a wife, she was supposed to be a mother, she was holding the domestic scene together, if you like. And so to go against this by going into the pub and getting drunk was seen as abusing and turning against her societal role, if you like. So, for instance, you get the Bishop of Manchester in 1874. He's chairing a meeting of the Temperance Society in Manchester, and he says, a drunken woman is 10,000 times more degraded than a drunken man. And this gets lots of cheers and sort of applause. So it's very much ingrained in certainly middle-class male thought, and perhaps even female thought, that women shouldn't be engaging in this kind of behaviour at all.
Mm. And Gemma, you've also looked at gender, but what I love is you look at girlhood and this period between being a woman or a young woman and a child. Why were young girls in particular targeted in the temperance press when it came to fighting the vice of drinking?
So they were sort of targeted by the groups that I look at. So the British Women's Temperance Association, the Women's Total Abstinence Union, the groups that I consider. Quite simply, temperance was that it was ever declining, essentially. So although there is a lot of temperance groups around, and particularly female temperance groups around is what I look at, they had one eye on the future. Temperance begins to decline as we hit sort of the end of the 19th century. And I think they targeted young women and trying to bring them into their organisation simply to try and continue their work. So they have specific parts in their periodicals which are aimed at these women, at these young women and girls and things like that. Trying to keep them involved in the movement, essentially. But I think there's something interesting in temperance is positioned as a moral duty. So therefore it was okay for women to sort of be going into sort of slum areas, things like this, and go and visit drunkards, if you will, and to try and reform them and things. And I think there's something quite clever there. And I argue in several pieces of my work that actually the temperance movement is almost a precursor to the sort of women's liberation movement. It allows them to open up those spheres, those avenues of exploration for women's work, and it becomes sort of normalised that women are able to go out into, you know, we all know the breakdown of the public-private spheres is not accurate, but it allows them to sort of expand their areas of influence in quite an interesting way, and to move into political avenues. You know, yes, it's moral versus legislative, but there is a huge amount of crossover. So I think it's the relationship between gender, drinking, and also temperance is a really complicated one, but is one that's really, really interesting, actually.
Yeah, definitely. And now that you say that, it's actually they're buying into the gender stereotype by trying to be upstanding women. But as you say, they're breaking some traditions by going out there, interacting with these dangerous female drunkards. It is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
And I also think as well, there's a point that comes through with kind of your work, Craig, around these traditions of people in roles. So I think one of the things you talk about there is the tradition of paid factory work being different in Manchester compared to Liverpool. And I think that takes us into another aspect to all of the work in the sense of the Northwest actually as a region itself. Is there anything unique in how we're looking at this in kind of the Northwest alcohol and drinking cultures?
Yeah, I think there is actually. Certainly, Lancashire gains a reputation, particularly in the London press, as being a very violent, drunken, lawless place. And I think you're right in that it's to do with this factory culture, the sort of the employment status in Lancashire. I mean, not all Lancashire was industrial, not by a long way, but places like Liverpool, Manchester, the sort of satellite towns, if you like, around Manchester, the mill towns. There's concern about female employment, as there has been for a long time throughout the 19th century, that women are being supposedly corrupted by working with men. Again, they're being dragged away from their general gender role, if you like. But yeah, Lancashire does tend to get this reputation of being a drunken place. I mean, the Pall Mall Gazette calls it a plague of no ordinary magnitude in Lancashire. The Times seizes on the drunken statistics and basically says that Lancastrians have a propensity to get just as drunk as they can whenever they can. And I think it's tied into this industrial sort of mindset, if you like, of certain parts of the county. So whether it's true, I don't know. I don't think it was. I think it was an exaggeration, but certainly the London press sort of sees on this, and Lancashire gets this reputation, like I said, for being a drunken place.
And Gemma, with regard to the temperance movement, do you see anything in the northwest which differs from the rest of the country?
There's a huge concentration of temperance groups in the northwest, which is interesting that it's perceived as this really drunken place. So if you know the sort of satellite towns of Manchester, Atherton has its own branch, Ancoats does, the city centre of Manchester does, Tyldesley does. There's huge local groups essentially. But it's interesting that you're talking about that sort of factory idea, because I looked at the Ancoats branch of the British Women's Temperance Association, and I have the names and addresses of these women so I can find them in the census and things. And largely, these women were married to ex-congregational ministers, as we might expect. They had domestic help. It's firmly sort of backing up the idea of it's a middle-class movement. Whereas in the Ancoats branch, the president was married to a man who was a warehouse man, and the secretary was a weaver who was working as a weaver. So they didn't have domestic help. So that then takes that idea of actually it's firmly a middle-class movement, takes that idea away actually. So it's interesting that I think in Manchester there's perhaps more of a movement, again, of that self-improving idea. These women were not middle-class imposers of temperance on the working class actually. I think they were themselves, certainly a working class or upper working class a group of women who were trying to do good things.
And I wonder if there was something we haven't really touched too much on, but the financial interest behind temperance, particularly in industrial areas. Factory owners were really concerned about drinking impacting on the production of their material. So there's a moral component to temperance and behaviour, but there's also a huge financial element. And I wonder if that perhaps is why it's in the northwest that we see temperance and alcohol becoming a concern.
Perhaps, there's the famous instance, that in Birmingham of the chocolate factory, for instance, has this sort of model village set up with no pubs and treats its workers this way and encourages everyone to be temperate. So I think certainly there is something there that, it's in the factory owner's interest as well. Decline in drunkenness means your workers are going to be more present, etc. St. Monday is declined by this point, obviously. And I think, again, it's in line with this, industrialization drives certainly models of temperance and people sort of behaving themselves a little bit more, I think.
Definitely.
I was going to just pick up on the financial aspect a little bit with Craig's piece, actually, in the sense of, I just wonder if it's something worth saying in terms of, one of the things that comes through, I think, is this link between alcohol consumption and disposable income. And actually, there's also this flip side to it as well, because it is also then linked to poverty as well. Yeah. So you end up with this converse situation of alcohol being linked to people with disposable income, as well as being linked to poverty. And I wonder if it's just something worth saying about that.
Yeah, that means that the women I looked at who ended up in Strangeways are all from really poor areas of Salford and Rochdale and Manchester. So places like Ancoats was one, Angel Meadow, Chapel Street, Greengate, all the sort of really sort of poor areas of town, if you like. I don't believe, I've done a great deal of work on actually the cost of alcohol. I believe it was fairly low and fairly static throughout my period. I might be wrong on that, but I don't think it was particularly expensive. And to be honest, if people did have disposable income, a lot of women that I looked at were married. It was probably their only way of of getting any sort of leisure time or enjoying themselves out of the home. So really, a lot of any sort of extra cash that they had would probably go down to the beer house or the pub. Beer houses in particular, very sort of cheap way of getting drunk very quickly. They had a reputation for selling sort of booze cheaply, so you could get drunk on not very much. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we talk about poverty. Debate in Victorian times: did poverty cause drunkenness, or did drunkenness cause poverty? I'm not sure that was ever really answered by the Victorians.
I don't know if we've answered that now, to be honest.
No. It's probably still sort of talked about today. But yeah, I mean, it was mainly poor people who were picked up by the police and poor people who were imprisoned. And I think it was just a case of whatever little money they had, they just went to the pub because that was their release at the end of the week. And I think that was it.
Gemma, how do you think attitudes towards drinking changed since the 19th century?
To today? I think there's still this view that Craig was talking about earlier of female drunkenness being seen somehow as worse than male drunkenness. We all know there's the pictures that are famous among sort of drinking historians of, you get the women on the benches nowadays that are splashed over sort of certain tabloids and things like that of, look at them, look at how they're behaving. And it's no different to me to how we were vilifying women in the Victorian period for drinking and for that moment of escapism, etc. I'm not condoning heavy drinking or anything like this, but to me that sort of moralizing, looking down at people for getting drunk or for choosing to drink, that doesn't feel like it's changed very much. And I feel like there's, especially now, obviously we're in sort of COVID era, and there's this tone of people who are seen at, going out, following the rules, but going out drinking on a weekend, they're somehow blamed in all of this, I think, for spreading COVID, etc. So I think that holier than thou moralizing tone is still very much present when it comes to attitudes about drinking, gender, and particularly young people, I think, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. Craig, did you have anything to add to that?
Only to find that I think that perhaps there's more of a health focus these days, perhaps more than there was in Victoria. We're a lot more aware now of how many units we should or shouldn't be drinking on a weekly basis. Whether I think there's still probably people still look down their noses perhaps at sort of Deansgate in Manchester on a Saturday night, or certain areas of Soho's in the news quite a lot recently about people going out, but I think that was mainly due to the sort of COVID. But yeah, I mean, drinking is still very much a focus of moralising. Perhaps more now we're looking more at the health risks than perhaps was the case back in the 19th century.
Well, yeah, I think I've come away from this discussion knowing that there are, as Gemma has said, there are still lots of continuities with how we in British society interact with drinking, both the excessiveness of it, but also attitudes towards that excessiveness.
Certainly, and I think I'd both like to say thank you, first of all, to Craig and to Gemma for taking part in this discussion today. Thank you, because I think it's given us a really great insight into the history of drinking itself and the attitudes that come with people drinking and the kind of the movements around stopping drinking, actually. And dare I say, I think it is fast becoming one of my favourite fields of history. There we go. Just to be a purely interactive podcast for the purposes of the listeners out there as well, I wonder if it's just worth saying if anyone has a favourite drink.
I will always favour a gin and tonic, I'm going to be honest with you, which is interesting with the histories of gin, etc. But yes, gin and tonic is my preferred drink of choice.
Fantastic. And Craig?
At the moment, I'm going through a phase of, I've discovered the hazy IPA, which is something that's very, especially this weather, it's very nice. Yeah, excellent.
No, I won't mention any brands, but I'm very into my cloudy IPAs.
Yeah, there's a couple of brewers in Manchester, craft brewers in Manchester, they're doing very good work. So let's leave it at that.
But as Adam knows, I always favour a gin and tonic.
I'm going to throw one curveball in there, gin and ginger. I feel like that is my duty, my public duty to recommend. But no, thank you to Craig and Gemma there. Thank you very much for taking time to join us. It is really appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Adam, do you know anything more about alcohol?
I'm just grabbing a drink. It's not alcoholic, it is water. So I thought that was fascinating. That was really interesting, Gemma and Craig talking there. Yeah, and I feel like I've learned quite a lot there in the sense of both attitudes to drink, attempts to regulate drink, and the thing that stood out for me though was just how individuals are involved in this as much as kind of broader ways of thinking about history in the sense of moralising attitudes. Actually, the individuals involved. Both Gemma and Craig's kind of work, Craig talking about kind of working class police officers having to police this, it really brought home actually the continuity and the changes.
What I really liked as well is that we had both sides of the story. We had the drinking side and the temperance side. So the practices and the response, which I think is fascinating, because I think we still have that duality today, don't we?
And also, like, I kind of think it's a really important part, you know, if we talk about this period, particularly up to the 20th century, alcohol plays such a huge part. I kind of feel like teetotalers are overlooked in a sense. As much as we talk about consumption, we should also talk about how people reacted against that as much as for it.
Definitely. And I think teetotalers have often got a bad reputation for being, rule followers who just want to destroy all the fun. But actually, I think the modern day teetotalers are really the state, medics, the NHS, as Craig said, in terms of creating these units of alcohol. The teetotal brigade has literally it's just changed shape as opposed to disappeared.
It really, and yeah, even the point that Gemma was kind of making around gender as well, and the sense of, again, picked up a little bit by Craig in terms of talking about who is involved in these movements and, you know, actually who's being arrested and who's involved in the movements against that, I think pulls out some fascinating points about how we think about history as a broader concept and how we attach these values to thinking about working women, but then also not going the next step and thinking about how leisure pursuits tie in with that same type of work, and how then, you know, things like drink feed into leisure and work. And
also how women are educated about drink, which leads us to our next podcast, which will be looking in depth at education, particularly at university cultures in Greater Manchester. So thank you for joining us for this week's podcast. And thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Jess.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for MCR History Talks.
Bye-bye.